Hello, this is Bryant Myers, and welcome to my 2024 PEMF Buyers Guide. I've been off for a little while, but I'm excited to bring you a lot of updates and a lot of great information. And we're going to really go through everything you need to know on what to look for in a good PEMF device, and also what to avoid. So I want to really be clear and help steer you in the right direction if you're in the market for a device, so you can get the best possible device that's safe, effective, and will help you and your whole family. Now, in full disclosure, I am also an affiliate, and I do make commissions on devices that I recommend, and we're going to go through all the different devices. So let's get right into it here with the coils and coherence. So part one of this buyer's guide, I'm calling the setup. So I like to use the metaphor of a stereo and speakers and the music. So the setup is basically like your stereo and your speakers and the amplifier that you use. So we're going to go over the coils and the intensity. So this is kind of like, depending on what PEMF device you have, you might have something geared for more power or less. And you may have coils that give you really good sound, or good PEMF fidelity in this case. We're going to go over the signal, which is the heartbeat or the music of a PEMF system. So with the coils, I always like to refer people to the Qi coils with wireless phone chargers. And the Qi coils are a standardized type of coil design that the Wireless Power Consortium will certify a company with their charging device as Qi certified coils. And it turns out that Qi coils are very tightly wound. You know, here we got the IMRS full body mat and pad coil. Now, the Qi coils are smaller for your phone, but they are tightly wound circular coils just like this, a little bit smaller. And sometimes they're slightly oval, slightly square, but they're tightly wound, and this is the best way to transfer energy wirelessly. It's the most efficient way. So we want our coils to be ideally larger if we're using a full body mat, which I'm going to recommend, tightly wound, and you can get a Helmholtz configuration, which is even better. So when you get two pairs of coils that are wound in the same direction, the fields between them reinforce. And so you can do like, you know, at the IMRS, for example, has a really good hexagon spot. And you can work on your knees, your elbow, your wrist, and you can put one coil on each side, and you're really not getting any loss of intensity all the way through. So the coils are really, really important, and I do like both having a Helmholtz arrangement for local application and a full body mat. And the reason you want a full body mat is you want to work on your whole body at once to open up all those fractal branching networks I talk about in some of my videos, meaning you want to open up your circulation, lymphatics, nerve flow, meridian flow, and even in the tracheal bronchial tree to open up your airways. So this requires a full body mat. And even if you hurt your foot, you still need to get blood and nutrients and oxygen down there, and then lymph and help to get the waste products out, the elimination channel. So everything, even localized injuries, require a full body stimulation. So to me, the best combination is full body mat first, followed by local application second, if you have a localized issue. Now, some examples of bad coils are coils like that are found in those Chinese, I mean, there's a whole bunch of them now. And I've got like 12 of these mats, and they all use these same AM rod ferrite coils, which you can see here in Alibaba is like 50 cents each. Very cheap. And the problem with these coils are they have a ferrous core, and what that does is it concentrates the field right in the spot. So it's sucking all the field lines into the core, and that gives you a hot spot right above the coil, and then very little depth in and very little field to the right, left, and both sides of it. You know, anything that's not like a tightly wound circular, slightly oval, slightly square, is not going to give you very coherent field lines through the middle. So that's all I want to say about that. Let's now get into intensity. So now, how do we define magnetic field strength? The SI unit for magnetic field strength is the Tesla. It's defined by the force per unit length exerted on a current carrying wire. Because a Tesla is such a large strength, sometimes it's better to use Gauss, because the Earth's magnetic field is around by half a Gauss. So 1 Tesla equals 10,000 Gauss. And a Tesla is going to be typically like MRI strength intensities. You know, junkyard magnets that pick up entire cars are around 1 to 2 Tesla. Now, those field strengths are not natural. You're not going to find any Tesla intensities out in nature. In fact, it's the opposite. What you find in nature with the Earth's magnetic field is actually 0.25 to 0.65 Gauss, which is only 25 to 65 microtesla. A micro is 1/1,000,000th of a Tesla. So it's a very, very small, weak field compared to a Tesla. So to me, we should be using magnetic field strengths that are in the ballpark of what the Earth is giving us. So what's natural is not these high intensity systems that are using a Tesla or more. Those intensities are 20,000 times what's found in nature, not even close to being natural. I mean, a little bit more is fine, and we'll talk about that in Faraday induction effects and slew rate, but we still don't want to go over the top where we're going up to junkyard magnet intensities or intensities that are in alignment with MRIs, which is just way too high. So besides magnetic intensity, the flux is important. Again, this is hardly talked about. So the size of the coil matters. In fact, the penetration depth is based on, which is a definition of a 1/E drop-off, which means whatever intensity you have at the surface of the coil, whatever depth that is 37%, which is 1/E, that's called the penetration depth. And it's actually about 0.97 R, meaning it's almost exactly what the radius is. So the penetration depth of a coil is going to be like a little dome over the coil that's about the same radius, or a half a sphere. So if you've got little tiny coils, like the OMI coils are little tiny coils in their little pad, you're just going to get a little dimple of energy. It's just not enough penetration depth. And you can have the same intensity. And for example, with the OMI coil, it's 1 centimeter. IMRS is 11 centimeter radius, which means based on this equation for flux, which tells you how much energy is in the field, you're going to get 121 times more energy even with the same intensity. Because intensity is just a point measurement. You're just measuring the magnetic field at one spot. So now let's get into what I call kind of the biggest lie in the PMF industry, which is Dr. Pawluk's inverse square flaw, I call it. So let's just kind of go through a couple things, because Dr. Pawluk is probably the main spokesperson for recommending high intensity. So, but what's his justification for recommending higher intensity? Now, I'm going to claim he has no justification. So we can kind of get to the root of this inverse square flaw, or this myth of high intensity, by looking at his book, Power Tools for Your Health. And this is on page 13 here. And so I'm just going to read what he says here. So he says, research evidence continually and consistently shows that the intensity of a therapeutic magnetic field is important, perhaps more important than any other component. And then there's a little reference, 331. And so when we look at this reference, lo and behold, what do we find at the end of the book? We find that he's referencing himself. It's Pawluk, W. And I actually purchased the article in this dosimetry of bioelectromagnetics, and because I just want to know, where is he getting the inverse square law from? Because that's not the right equation. It's the Biot-Savart law. And it's not even close to giving you accurate numbers. So I'm like, where did he get this from? So from that article, I could find out, and you can see here on the screen this a screenshot of this paper, where he says, on the basis of the inverse square rule, various field intensities have been calculated by the author at various depths or distances away from the magnetic applicator source. So, and again, the author's him. So all these tables that he's making, you can see here in Power Tools for Your Health and his new book, Supercharge. He's the one that made those calculations, and they are just terrible. They're off by a lot. He's not even actually calculating the inverse square law properly, even though it's not the inverse square law. So it's just riddled with mistakes. It's just all gibberish, all of his tables. And sadly, the first half of his book, Supercharge, is good. I mean, he gives a good historical introduction to PMF, some good EMF versus PMF stuff. So the first half I like. The second half of his book, however, he gets into recommendations, and every single recommendation, he's referring you back to the end of the book to his inverse square law tables. So he's recommending you get a device at, say, 4,000 Gauss based on the inverse square law, when in reality, you don't even need 100 Gauss, as I'm going to show. So I did a test, and this is like the test of all tests to debunk Dr. Pawluk once and for all. So what I did is I took a magnetic loop, because the Biot-Savart law is easiest to calculate with a simple loop. So using the Biot-Savart law, I actually calculated the intensity drop-offs predicted by the correct equation. And the numbers that I got from the calculations were, well, it was you have to know the source in the middle. So when you take the measurement in the middle, it's 2.9 millitesla on this coil. So using a quantum Hall probe, which is one of the best ways to measure accurately fast-changing magnetic fields. So this is very accurate. And I made measurements, of course, at 0, 1 inch, 3, 4, and 5 inches. And then I calculated using the Biot-Savart law and then compared that to my actual field measurements. And you're going to see the images on the screen here. And I was actually a little surprised at how close and how perfectly. So again, you put that equation, all the numbers in the Biot-Savart law, and my numbers, of course, at 0, it's 2.9, it's going to be the same. At 1 inch, I got 2.75, which is right on, exactly what the predicted value said. 3 inches, I got 1.89 versus 2. So it was close. At 4 inches away, I got 1.46 when it should have been 1.5. So that's only a 2.6% error, very close. And then at 5 inches, I got 1.1 measured above the coil, and the calculation calculated 1.2. So theory confirms actual field measurements, that it is the Biot-Savart law. My average error was only 4%. Now, using Dr. Pawluk's inverse square law, let's compare it to the inverse square law. Now, based on Dr. Pawluk's table, if I use his table at 1, 3, 4, and 5 inches, now I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but the worst one was at 5 inches away, where the actual measurement was 1.1, and Dr. Pawluk's predicted value was 0.015. So while it was actually 1.1 millitesla, if Dr. Pawluk was right, which he's not, he should have gotten somewhere around 1.1 millitesla, because that was what I actually measured with a very accurate Hall sensor or Hall probe sensor. And so his error was 8,276% error, meaning the intensity was 82 times less than what he said. So what that means is Dr. Pawluk is recommending high intensity for no good reason. So for example, let's say in his book he said, okay, to get a certain field strength 5 inches into the body, you're going to need a PEMF device that's 8,200 Gauss. Well, because that's 82 times too high, you actually only need 100 Gauss. So you don't need 0.8 Tesla. You only need, 100 Gauss is 10 millitesla. So can you see the scam here? I mean, you don't need high intensity. And again, he's basing all of this on a study by this guy that looked at anti-inflammatory effects, and he found that about at 1.5 millitesla, you got the maximum benefit from anti-inflammation. So Dr. Pawluk's tables are all geared around trying to see, at what distance you need to get 1.5 millitesla. But interestingly enough, the original study, the coil itself at the source was 1.5 millitesla. So not even that was going in, it was dropping off. So just everything about this book, the second half of his book is just wrong. If Dr. Pawluk had any intellectual honesty, he would pull this book, redo it with the correct equation, and update his recommendations. If he's going to go by the 1.5 millitesla study, fine. But at least use the right equation. You're going to find, Dr. Pawluk, if you're watching this, you're going to find that you're only going to need to recommend like around 10 millitesla type of intensities or less, depending on how far you're trying to reach. Not, half to 1 Tesla or more. It's just ridiculous. So you definitely do not need high intensity. And in fact, we're going to talk about some of the dangers of high intensity later. But it's one last thing I want to mention here before we go to part 2 is that there was a study done of 3,200, it's a meta-analysis of 3,249 experiments looking at 92 publications. And they actually found most studies were in the low to low medium intensity. So the intensities Dr. Pawluk recommends, which are greater than 100 millitesla typically, not always, sometimes he'll recommend low, but usually he's recommending higher powered, represented only 3 to 4% of the studies. And again, 1 Tesla studies are even much less. So research does not confirm what Dr. Pawluk's saying. In fact, in that chapter I showed you, he does reference like 5 and 6 studies on low and medium intensity, but only puts 1 on high intensity, and it was for analgesic purposes. not for healing. So that's just a numbing and dumbing effect. So that's all I want to say about intensity. Okay, so now let's get into part 2 on the signal. Okay, the signal, I tell people, is the music of a PEMF device. It's the heartbeat. It's the secret sauce that really makes it work. Now, you do have to have the setup right. You do need a good stereo and good speakers. You do need a good PEMF control unit that has a sufficient amount of power and good coils to give you a high fidelity signal. But the music itself is the most important thing, and this is the actual signal. And I'm going to break it down into what I think are the most important components of a good PEMF signal. And that is the slew rate, or the Faraday induction effects, the repetition rate, or the brain entrainment effects, and the spectral content, which are the resonant effects. It really makes sense to me that these are the keys, along with safety. You know, we got to make sure that not only that we have a good resonance, a good repetition rate, and a good slew rate, but are we using intensities and slew rates that are safe? So let's start with the Faraday induction, or the slew rate. So this is one of the most important things. And I always like to start off by an explanation of slew rate using a little credit card reader analogy. So a credit card is going to have a magnetic strip. This is a magnet on the back with information coded on it. So when you take the credit card and you swipe it, okay, if you swipe it slow, you're not going to get much of a signal to the credit card reader. This cord goes to the credit card reader. So a faster swipe, if you go like really fast, you get a stronger signal. So hopefully it makes sense that to get a good amount of induction, which you're trying to stimulate those healing microcurrents in the tissue, which is why I call PEMF 3D microcurrent therapy, because it's the microcurrents that, in large part, that along with the resonant effects, that are driving the healing processes. So having a changing magnetic field that induces healing microcurrents deep in the body is one of the keys. And when we look at, and I didn't mention this, but when we look at a signal, we want to look at it with 2 eyes. One is the eye of an oscilloscope, which is the time domain. So this shows us the shape of the signal. And the other, which we'll look at in a minute, is the frequency domain, which shows us all the frequencies on a spectrum analyzer. But the shape of the signal, again, typically to get a good slew rate, is going to have a sharp rise and fall, like a square wave, or like a triple sawtooth, like QRS, IMRS. Companies that use a good sawtooth are going to get a sharp rise. It's like a parabolic swing, but then it just, boom, goes up and gets you a really nice sharp rise. So the signal shape is important, and typically it's important because of the repetition rate and the slew rate. Let me put the credit card reader aside here. So all this research on slew rate and induction effects actually started with Robert Becker and Andrew Bassett and Arthur Pilla, because they were way back in the late 60s and early 70s. They were using microcurrents to heal bones. And both Arthur Pilla and Andrew Bassett were on the same plane on the way to orthopedic conference. So it was kind of a fortuitous meeting. And as the story goes, Arthur Pilla was kind of overlooking Andrew Bassett and the fact that they were using microcurrents and electrodes to stimulate bone healing. And Arthur Pilla is like, you can do this. You can do that with induction coils. You can actually non-invasively induce microcurrents through Faraday's law of induction, because a changing magnetic field induces currents in the body, where electrodes are adding currents to the body. So that led to the original, in 1979, the original FDA-approved bone stimulator I'll show you an image here on the screen, by Andrew Bassett. And this was FDA-approved for non-union fractures, and it was very effective. It actually used the sawtooth waveform. So both the QRS and IMRS were kind of inspired by that study. And that's what they used in the original bone stimulator. And it was low intensity. It was only around 2 Gauss. So they were not using high intensity. In fact, Robert Becker found by accident with his student Frederick Brown that on the lowest microcurrent setting, they got the most stem cells, which leads us to the NASA study, which showed, using the square wave, a sharp rise and fall, that they were able to upregulate 150 or more genes associated with healing. That's really profound, including a 400% increase in neuronal stem cells, using a very low intensity signal. It was only 10 microtesla. I would say one of the main takeaways from that study was that we have a new way to standardize looking at PEMF devices, which is the slew rate. So or the dB or dφ/dt is how the slew rate is defined. And so they found that was the key parameter, not intensity. The key thing was how quickly that signal would rise and fall, and what the slew rate was. So again, you do need a certain amount of intensity to get a good slew rate. But if you have a really sharp rise time, or you could say a very short rise time, you end up here, we've got this little, it looks like a trapezoid. You never can get a perfect square wave because it's impossible. You need an infinite amount of energy. And no electronics is infinitely fast. But you can get really close. And so, as an example, you can get let's say a therapeutic. They found a therapeutic rate of 5 to 10 Tesla per second in Robert Dennis's subsequent study. So you could get, say, 10 Tesla per second either by taking an intensity up to 1 Tesla in 1/10 of a second. But again, that's going to be a really high intensity. It's not really, I feel it's not really safe to use every day. But you don't need to do that. You can actually get the same slew rate with, say, a 1 millitesla intensity signal if you got 100 microsecond rise time. So if you got a really fast rise time, you do the math, you can still get 10 Tesla per second. You don't need more intensity, you need more Faraday induction, because that sharp rise and fall is what's inducing all those healing microcurrents. It's helping improve meridian flow. It's helping open up, it stimulates nitric oxide, opens up your circulation, lymphatics. The healing microcurrents will stimulate the electron transport chain to help ATP production, increases stem cells, reduces inflammation. In fact, it simulates the benefits of exercise. And this is the reason why when you work out with weights, not only do your muscles grow, but your bones get thicker, because those microcurrents stimulate the bone density to increase. So by increasing microcurrents, a bunch of growth factors happen, because again, this is your body's natural, response when you, like even if you cut yourself, you get like an increase of voltage, like salamanders are the most extreme example, where they get a big voltage swing and they can regenerate whole limbs. So after the NASA study, Robert Dennis did a rabbit bone study, which was also a very good study, one of the best studies on slew rate. And he found that 10 Tesla per second was better than 5 Tesla per second, and less than 5 Tesla per second was not effective. So we have the beginnings here of creating a biphasic dose response curve, just like red light therapy and other disciplines have. PEMF is kind of lacking in this, but I've spent a lot of time looking at many slew rate studies, in fact, at least 10 studies here. And it seems, again, this is just a beginning. I want to kind of get the conversation going, hopefully collaborate with some other good researchers out there, and to create an effective biphasic dose response. And you can see this chart here, because with a biphasic dose, yes, too little is not enough. Like if you take too little vitamin C, you're not going to get enough benefit, right? You need a certain amount of milligram dosage to get the benefits of the immune system, all the benefits you get from vitamin C. But if you keep taking too much vitamin C, though, you keep this biphasic dose, you hit the point where you get bowel tolerance and you get diarrhea. So you take 20,000 milligrams. Well, see, more is not better. And this is the problem with this high intensity approach, is all these high intensity machines, we have a 3 Tesla machine now. Ours goes up to 4 Tesla. They're just trying to beat each other in marketing with more Tesla, but that's way on the wrong side of the curve, as we'll see. So all the best slew rate studies I could find, at most would show 150 Tesla per second, but most of them were within 5 to 30 Tesla per second. So if I had to just draw a little biphasic dose response, I would have it sharply go up at 5 Tesla per second, because there's not many studies under 5 Tesla per second. There's a couple, but not many, where there are studies to show that 2.5 Tesla per second, for example, was not enough. And if you don't really follow what that means, just think of it as like milligrams of vitamin C. So you need a certain amount of slew rate, a certain amount of healing induction for beneficial physiological effects to happen. And it seems that around 5, if I have to pick a number to start, is a pretty good number. Again, referencing Robert Dennis's rabbit bone study. But then even 10 is even better. Like in that study, he found even better results at 10 Tesla per second. But now, if you keep going, one study showed that that 30 Tesla per second was working better than 100 and 150 Tesla per second. So it seems that things are going down after 30 or 50. Now, this is not definitive. I mean, there's no, because there was one study that showed that 90 Tesla per second was good. That's why I put this point out here at 90. But it seems that certainly, even though the 150 study didn't seem to show effect, I would say, around 200 Tesla per second. There's just not really many studies above that, except for electroporesis effects, which I'll talk about in a minute. So now, to get those intensities, you only need like several hundred microtesla. Like with the IMRS pillow, I was able to measure on the square wave of the IMRS 15 Tesla per second at the surface, and even 4 inches up, I was getting 4 Tesla per second. With the spot applicator, which is a higher intensity, you're going to even get a higher number than that, and it won't drop off. So the IMRS pillow is a good example of a device that has a low intensity but a high slew rate, because again, it's a very sharp rise and fall. And so you can get a good slew rate with a low intensity. Another device, the one that I measured over here in part 1, was a 3 millitesla at the surface. And we were getting very therapeutic slew rates, even 4 or 5 inches up. So Dr. Pawluk's type of devices, or MagnaWave, or Pulse Centers XL, or, the amp coil, the Tesla Fit, the Curatron Flash, all these really high intensity devices, the slew rates are in the tens of thousands of Tesla per second. And this is way off the other side of the biphasic curve if you create a biphasic dose with actual research studies of slew rate. And even one study on slew rate was a meta-analysis of other slew rate studies. There was nothing that was going above 100, 150. So slew rate is important. It's just like anything, there's a certain sweet spot or a Goldilocks zone of just the right amount of slew rate to give the maximum beneficial physiological effect. And just about anything, like sunlight, if you don't get enough sun, you don't get enough vitamin D, you get seasonal affective disorder, et cetera, et cetera. You get too much sun, you get a sunburn, you can get skin cancer. So there's a therapeutic range of natural sunlight that's good for you, but you don't want too little and you don't want too much. Same with exercise. You overtrain, you can hurt yourself. If you undertrain, you're going to get overweight and be unhealthy. So let's talk about repetition rate now. This is a really easy one. So the frequency is a complicated thing in complex signals. With a simple sine wave, the frequency is the frequency. I mean, it's just simple. But when you have a square wave or a sawtooth, it's not so simple because, there's many frequencies involved in creating a sawtooth and a square wave. But typically we can talk about the pulses per second, which is the number of square waves per second or sawtooths per second. And this is what seems to have the effect on the central nervous system or on the circadian rhythms. So we want our repetition rate of our pulses per second to be within known brain state parameters. So for example, the IMRS, one of the units I recommend the most still, does this very well. So you typically would want in the morning more of a beta stimulation, which is going to be between ideally 13 to 23 hertz, which is mean you want your pulses per second to be, 13 to 23 hertz. Now in the evening, ideally, you want more theta delta. You want to slow these pulses per second down. So we want the repetition rate to be in alignment with the beta, alpha, theta, delta brain waves based on the time of day. And this is important because if you're using a high frequency close to bedtime, it'll keep you awake. And the IMRS uses like 0.5 to 3 hertz. So they're very good, which is my first testimonial using that device was better sleep the first night. That's what really got my attention because I was having insomnia at the time. So repetition rate is important, and surprisingly, a lot of PEMF companies don't get this right. Okay, the next thing is very, very important, the magnetic resonance, the resonance component. So this is now looking at the signal in the frequency domain. That is to say, if you take a spectrum analyzer and you break up that signal into all the signs, frequencies that make it up, or cosine frequencies that make it up, you see the spread of frequencies, like a graphic equalizer on your stereo. It's like but from high treble to low bass and everything in between. What you're seeing is all the frequencies. You're seeing the music in the frequency domain. So if you got a lot of treble, you're going to have more higher frequencies. If you have a lot of bass, you're going to have more lower boom, boom, boom frequencies. So typically, with a good PMF signal, we want it's called the spectral content, which is kind of like in a multivitamin, like all the different vitamins and minerals you're getting. So because all the different tissues, cells, molecules, and molecular reactions have all these different frequency resonances or natural resonances, it makes sense to me, and it still makes sense to me, that you want a signal that really blankets this biologically active spectrum. And interestingly, it turns out that a good square wave will give you, because again, to create a sharp rise in a Fourier transform, you need a lot of frequencies to do that. So if you got just a spike, the sharper the spike, the more frequencies you get. So it turns out that usually when you have a sharp rise and fall signal, you end up with a lot of frequencies. If you got a simple sine wave, you get both a poor slew rate and you're only getting one frequency at a time. There's so many sine wave systems. The cheap Chinese systems are just using 60 hertz sine wave as their carrier. You want a signal with a good spectral content, not just a simple sine wave. So what this is saying is that when you supply all the body with all this broad spectrum of frequencies, this is like a good multivitamin. It's stimulating all the tissues and cells and reactions and molecules to give you a more, again, it's wireless transfer of energy. I always tell people PMF is like a whole body battery charger, and it can recharge the body battery via slew rate or induction, like a brute force induction, but you can also use magnetic resonance. So newer technologies like Witricity that are not really to market yet use this resonant inductive coupling system where you can charge your phone or whatever several feet away. And that's using magnetic resonance. So we can transfer energy wirelessly, even like your radio. When you pick up a radio signal, it's a wireless resonant energy transfer. And so we're trying to stimulate this transfer of energy to the body because sick cells and weak cells have low cell voltage. So one of the goals of PMF is to increase cellular voltage along with increasing better circulation, lymphatics, nerve flow, meridian flow, etc. So we can do that with magnetic resonance. So, and again, when you get a broader spectrum of frequencies, you're going to energize more tissues and cells. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so I just want to show you this image here from James Oshman's excellent book on energy medicine, because this is a table that shows how various tissues have different resonant frequencies. So again, you can see that we want a signal that's going to really blanket this biologically active, especially 0 to 300 hertz. The higher frequencies are important for the inductive effects too, so you do want those. And it's worth noting that in nature, around lightning strikes, we do get 20, 30,000 hertz. But you're not going to find much out in nature above 100,000 hertz. So that's, besides high intensity being not natural, really high frequencies are not natural either. So I'm not a big fan of the megahertz systems that they use, like a megahertz burst, like the Diapulse, or even the Sissy Loop and some of the lesser expensive ones. They're using like 13 or 27 megahertz. That's just a little too high. Again, this buyer's guide is about what to look for and what to avoid. So what we want is a PMF system with good coils, the right amount of intensity, not too much, not too little, and we want a signal that has a good slew rate, the proper repetition rate, and a broad spectrum of frequencies. These, to me, are the most important things of a PMF device. And we want a full body mat device for full body resonance, and we want a local applicator to work on local issues, preferably with a Helmholtz setup if we can get a double coil with a Helmholtz like that.